What will future generations condemn us for? When we consider some of the examples of things that we used to do that were very common, but we now consider to be morally repugnant, right? Some of the things that we used to do, like child labor, beating one's spouse or one's children, slavery, some of these examples of what people used to do, we now recognize as being much more than just morally problematic, but as being downright immoral. So one might naturally ask the question, what were these people thinking back then? How could those people have done those sort of things? How could a good person do such a bad thing? Were those people just not very good people in the first place? Were they morally terrible folk? One natural way to respond to such a question is to think that back then folk were in the habit of dehumanizing other people for the purpose of perhaps using them in whatever way they wanted or not respecting their humanity. While that might have something to do with it, that's not going to be the best explanation. Insofar as right now, there are plenty of examples we can point to where people are still in the practice of attempting to dehumanize other people for the purpose of using them in one way or another. So it looks like we need some better explanation than that. Perhaps what we could do is just think about what are the chances that future generations will condemn us for similar sort of atrocities? For our current practices, what are the sort of things that we're currently doing right now that future generations will think are just morally repulsive? We might wonder, is there a way to try to forecast or predict what the future generations will say about ourselves? It might be really helpful if we can anticipate what the future generations will say of our current behaviors, insofar as that will allow us to make a difference right now. And it might provide the opportunity we need to make a change. Well, one thing that we can do is we can look at the past and we can consider in what way did a change occur back then with regard to situations that we now take to be morally wrong, and what sort of things had to take place in order for there to be a change made back then. That is, we can consider some of those examples and try to devise some kind of a criteria to think about with regard to our own behavior. Here are three particular ways in which we might do this. The first thing that we might say is that, well, there were people back then who already knew of or were already familiar with the sort of arguments that were being made with regard to whatever that particular behavior was. So take, for example, waterboarding. Most people today will consider waterboarding or torture as being a morally terrible thing to do. It's interesting, though, because waterboarding and this form of torture was actually invented by the Catholic Church. So you might think, how could something like the Catholic Church, which is supposed to be a paradigm example of people that are doing morally good things, how could these morally good people be doing something that we now consider to be such a terrible thing, such a morally wrong thing like waterboarding? Well, if we recognize that there were arguments people were making against this behavior, and that people were becoming familiar with these sort of arguments, there was a particular point in time when what emerged from this discussion was a debate between different sides in the public forum where people were beginning to recognize the arguments being made against something like torture or waterboarding. So that's one thing that we can establish, that there were certain people who already knew of or were already aware of the sort of arguments being made against the behavior. A second point that we can make is that the defenders of that particular behavior tend not to offer morally based responses to these arguments, but instead, their responses to these type of arguments oftentimes focused on something like tradition or human nature or the necessity of the behavior, right? So they might say things like, well, that's just the way we've always done things. That's our tradition in this particular culture. That's the way we've always done things, and there's no way that we're going to change our tradition. Or the defenders might say something like, that's just human behavior. Men will be men. That's the sort of response that oftentimes was given with regard to people who would abuse their spouses or their children. The sort of responses you might hear of defenders of people who were sexist in one way or another. Those things we now consider to be morally problematic or morally terrible behaviors. But the defenders back then would say that's just human nature. That's just the way men are. Or they might offer some sort of appeal to necessity. Even though we might like to change it, there's no way we possibly can. There's nothing we can do. That's just the necessity that's involved. That's just what we have to live with. That's another type of response that was sometimes offered. And so instead of offering responses to these arguments that were based upon moral principles, the defenders of these sort of behaviors would appeal to things like tradition, human nature, or just the necessity of the behavior. And then the third thing that we can say is that the behavior was typically accompanied by some sort of strategic ignorance. So maybe people sort of knew what was happening, but they would not be willing to talk about it in the public forum. Take, for example, situations where there was child labor taking place. We now think that child labor is a morally terrible kind of behavior. Well, there might have been a period of time where people thought maybe that was a pretty bad thing to do, but as long as we can ignore it, as long as nobody's talking about it, then we're going to let it slide for one reason or another. And similar things might be said about other sorts of morally problematic behavior. Maybe abusing one's spouse. Yeah, we sort of recognize that that's not a very good thing to do. That's morally wrong. But as long as nobody's going to talk about it, there's this kind of strategic ignorance involved, then, that's fine. Whatever happens in Susie Jane's house, that's fine. As long as it's not happening in my house, I don't really care. That kind of ignorance oftentimes was accompanied by this sort of morally problematic behavior. And so that's a third thing that we can say. So these are three sort of signs that we can recognize when we look back on the history of the different sort of cases that we were considering and recognize these three sort of signs as a way to help us indicate what sort of behaviors we're currently engaging in that might be considered to be really terrible behaviors in the future, what future generations will condemn us for. So that raises the question, what sort of behaviors are we currently engaged in? What sort of things are we currently doing as a society that future generations will look back on us and say, how could they have possibly done something so morally wrong, such a morally terrible thing? So let's consider some ways in which we might consider our current behaviors to be morally problematic. Take, for example, the prison system, our current for-profit industrialized prison system. It turns out that the United States has about 4% of the entire world's population, and the United States has about 25% of its prison population. And that just seems absurd. That's just a ridiculously large amount of people that are in prison right now. And there's numerous other problems with the prison system that we can point to. For instance, there's a history of systemic racism involved in the prison system. And when we consider the post-Civil War period, the prison system was oftentimes used to keep the Black population enslaved. And this was actually allowed by the Constitution because the 13th Amendment granted freedom to everybody unless if they were a criminal, in which case they could be put in prison and treated basically as a slave and used to make goods and to rebuild the South. And this was just one way in which the roots of our current prison system is clearly problematic. It also looks to be morally problematic insofar as it's a for-profit system. So there's actually a monetary incentive to put more and more people into the prison population. And this really exploded in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, when you had new government policies such as the three-strike rule and mandatory sentencing and all sorts of different ways in which money was being put into the prison system and into policing in general. And all of this really provided a new kind of incentive, which you might think was morally problematic. There are a number of different ways in which we might think that our current prison system is just morally bankrupt. So you might wonder, to what extent will future populations condemn us for our current practice with regard to the prison system? You might wonder, to what extent are there currently arguments that are being considered on both sides arguments against the prison system, and to what extent are defenders of the prison system responding to those arguments, or are the defenders of the prison system appealing to things like human nature, or to the necessity of the prison system, the necessity of the policing system that we have? Or are they responding by appealing to tradition? This is just the way that we've always done things. This is the way that our society handles criminals. These sort of ways in which defenders of the prison system might reflect the same kind of responses that we saw with regard to other morally problematic behaviors. We also might wonder, to what extent is this behavior accompanied by a kind of strategic ignorance? As long as we keep the prisoners over there, nobody has to worry about them. If I don't have to know about what's happening, then I don't really care if it's morally problematic or not. Of course, this is actually changing right now with the Black Lives Matter movement that's taking place and the protests that are taking place and the sort of calls for reforms to the policing system. These are different indications, different signs that are suggesting that maybe future generations will look back on our current situation and think that we were doing something morally problematic with regard to a for-profit prison system. There are other cases that we could consider. For example, industrial meat production with regard to factory farming. That might be another situation where future generations will look back on us and think that what we are doing was morally wrong. Another example would be the institutionalization and the isolation of the elderly population. Approximately 2 million Americans are institutionalized in one form or another, who are also part of the elderly population. So we might think that that itself is problematic. And when we stop to consider some of the abuses that are involved in these institutions, one might start to think that our future generations will look back on us and wonder, why in the world would we ever treat the elderly community in such a way? And a fourth example is the environment. In what ways are we currently treating the environment that the future generations to come after us will look back and think, why in the world would that previous generation have acted in such a way with such a disregard for the future generations that have to live with the consequences of their behaviors? You might think the environment is a really interesting example because there are numerous different arguments that are being made. And it's not clear at all that the defenders of our current behaviors with regard to the way in which we treat the environment, the way in which we pollute the environment, it's not clear that they're doing much more than just appealing to things like human nature, the necessity. It's just necessary because we live in a capitalist society, that's just the result that we're going to get. So unless if we give up the kind of capitalism that we're accustomed to, then there's just nothing we can do about it. These type of responses, you might think, are signs or ways of indicating that our current behaviors are morally problematic. And there are likely many other sort of things that we could consider, lots of different sort of situations where what we're currently doing is morally problematic, even though we don't currently recognize it as being morally problematic. But it still makes sense to ask whether or not future generations will look back at our current behaviors and condemn us for the things that we're doing. And the reason why this is really important for us to consider in a course like this is because we're going to be talking about a lot of different applied ethical situations where you have to start thinking about whether or not what you're currently doing is morally all right, whether it's morally permissible, or would future generations condemn you for the things that you're currently doing? And if that's the case, then maybe what you need to do is do something different. Maybe we should all do something different with regard to some of these behaviors. On the other hand, by thinking about how future generations might condemn us for our current behaviors, it also puts us in a situation where we need to be able to offer reasons and arguments in support of the things that we believe, in support of the behaviors that we are engaging in. So if, for example, you think that it's morally permissible to kill animals for the purpose of food, then you might need to be able to provide arguments and reasons in support of that belief. Otherwise, you might think that future generations are going to condemn us for such behaviors if it turns out that these really are morally problematic behaviors. And we might say similar things about all kinds of different ethical situations that we're going to consider throughout this course.